coming out today on this kind of rain-threatened afternoon. But what we're going to look at is a study of kind of politics in the Dead Sea Scrolls. As I was thinking about the overall tenor of the program, the kind of lectures that you've been hearing about today. The Dead Sea Scrolls, I always say in my lectures, the story about the scrolls is as fascinating as the story of the scrolls, as what they actually contain. So today, I'm going to actually focus on the story of the discovery and the publication of the Dead Sea Scrolls and show you how modern politics and scholarship all kind of interplayed to bring us to this state where we are today. And some of the drawbacks, the pitfalls of all of that, and also some of the benefits of it along the way. I will, here and there, give you some idea of what's in the scrolls and why they're important, why they're significant for our knowledge of the ancient world. And at the end, I'll have plenty of time for question and answer if you want to delve in a little bit more on that topic. So, here we go. We have to understand a little bit of the geography of the scrolls. Do we want to turn the lights down? Can you all see in the back? Is it good?
It's kind of blurred, Dr. Larson.
Let's see, and we may need to, I don't know if the projector has a little bit of, better?
You can tighten it up a little bit.
It's still blurry.
I'm not sure where the focus on the projector is. Anybody know? But it will help us out a lot if we can.
If anyone knows, it's Ingrid.
Okay.
The pressure is on.
She's a lifesaver. I would give her a scholarship.
I like him. You want me to turn?
Oh, if your cell phones are on, if you don't mind moving to vibrate or turning them off, that'd be appreciated.
I think this is something for the media department.
That's it? Okay.
Yeah.
Is it pretty clear, though?
It's okay. I think it's fine.
Okay. So this, as you can easily see, this is the coastline of Israel. I just wanted to give you a little sense of where we are located. You can see in the land of Israel, at the north there you have the Dead Sea. At the south, at the Sea of Galilee, at the south you have the Dead Sea. And in connecting them in between is the Jordan River. So to the left or the west is Israel, and to the right is Jordan. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered not so far from, let's see if I get the controls right, from Jerusalem. Really only it's about 20 miles away, a little bit less than 20 miles away, down by the shores of the Dead Sea. We call them the Dead Sea Scrolls. They weren't found in the Dead Sea, but they were found in caves along the shores of the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is the lowest spot on the surface of the earth, the farthest below sea level. In other words, if it wasn't for the intervening land, the sea would rush right in and cover the whole area. It was there in the winter of 1946, 1947, that three Bedouin shepherds, actually there's two in the picture here, three Bedouin shepherds were tending flocks of sheep down on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. The gentleman on the right is the famous Muhammad Adhib, or Muhammad the Wolf, and he's the one who's usually credited with the first discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are actually two stories about the discovery of the scrolls. One of them says that one of the older men who was with him had dreams of finding buried treasure, and that he would become wealthy in his old age and live a life of luxury and ease. And so he made it a kind of a habit that whenever he saw a cave he didn't know what was in there, he would go in to explore and look around. The other story is the more famous one. It talks about the lost goat. You can see here the picture of the first cave where scrolls were found. It's kind of a hilly area. This is not the area where sheep would get lost, but what they were pasturing back in these days were their goats. And a goat had disappeared. They're looking around for the goat. They see an opening in the cave, and they throw a rock in to maybe scare the goat, but instead they hear the breaking of pottery. It was late in the day when they found the cave, on whatever story we go by, And so they decided, we don't have time to get into the cave now. And the next day they had to take their herds elsewhere, but they decided they would come back soon and see if they could look around and see what there was to find. So a short while later, they wind up back at the cave location. As they get there, it's towards twilight and too late to do anything that day. They decide they'll wake up and bright and early the next morning, they will enter the cave. Well, the young man, Muhammad the Wolf, he was the first one up, and he quietly slipped away before his two companions were awake. He shimmied into the hole, because the first cave hole, even though at the bottom where you think the opening is, that's the modern opening that they kind of cut open later, but the actual original hole is that little dark area up at the top. So he actually had to climb up, squeeze through, and when he got in there, he found jars. These jars are very unusual in their shape and size. They raise the question, what exactly were they for? Some people think they were designed to hold scrolls in particular, but in any event, these are the types of jars that they found in the scroll caves. And when they opened up the jars, inside, they found ancient scrolls that were covered, wrapped in cloth. The cloth was preserved, and the scroll was preserved. This is one of the most famous scrolls to come from the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the end, we're talking about a library of some 900 manuscripts. This was just a huge treasure trove of ancient writings. Very unusual, nothing quite like this, and especially not from this part of the world. We have large manuscripts finds from Egypt, but not so much from the land of Israel. This scroll, you could tell the top of it is very well preserved. The bottom of it has a little bit eaten away. So it was evidently rolled up, standing on the bottom, and you could see a little dampness had started to come and eat away. This scroll is very, very well preserved. Most of the other Dead Sea Scrolls that we have are in small little fragments. So we have a wide range of preservation states for the Dead Sea Scrolls. This scroll, when it's unwound, winds up to be about 24 feet long, and it contains the entire book of Isaiah from chapter 1 through chapter 66, written in a very beautiful Hebrew script. It dates to about 125 BC. Not all the scrolls were so well preserved. And here's another scroll from the original scroll. Now, bottom line, we can divide the scrolls down into two different types. Some are Bible manuscripts, and some, like this one, we call it the Thanksgiving Scroll because it contained hymns some of which were addressed to God, thanking Him for deliverance and for help in time of need. And these hymns sound very much like our biblical psalms, but they're different. So here's the first fact about the Dead Sea Scrolls that you might want to take away from the lecture. Some of the scrolls are biblical texts. In fact, about a third of the Dead Sea Scrolls are Bible manuscripts. So if I said there are 900, we have about 250, 300 Bible manuscripts from the Dead Sea Scrolls. They are the earliest copies that we have of a biblical text. There's a couple other little inscriptions. There's debate people have. They're earlier than the Dead Sea Scrolls, but they're not really Bible manuscripts. They're like verses that were copied, one on an amulet and one on a piece of astrakhan and so on. The Bible manuscripts. The earliest complete Bible manuscript we have in Hebrew dates from about 1008, and it's in a museum now in Leningrad. The Dead Sea Isaiah scroll takes us back about 1100 years before that time. So this is one reason why the Dead Sea Scrolls are so important. We have copies of all the Bible books except for the book of Esther. And everybody's wondered about Esther at Qumran, about Esther in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Was it that they didn't believe Esther was part of the Bible if they didn't have it, or was it some other reason? Truth be told, there's no real answer that we can give. All we know is that it wasn't there. Maybe it was there originally, but it just didn't survive. It's a small book after all, and so maybe the copies of it, for whatever reason, didn't make it through the passage of time. But it's a mystery that remains until this day. one other thing I want to say about this one. The other manuscripts are non-biblical manuscripts. And what do they tell us? They're the majority. These are texts that were written in the last few centuries BC. So just before the time when early Christianity begins and when Rabbinic Judaism arises, which is the form of Judaism from which our modern forms of Judaism are derived. So these non-biblical Dead Sea Scrolls give us kind of a snapshot of what people were thinking at one of the most creative and important times in the history of what will become two major religions, Judaism and Christianity. Now the texts themselves, the Bedouin didn't really know what to do with the manuscript finds. The sources tell us, the stories tell us that for a while they hung in bags from a tent pole. We have a few stories about people playing with the scrolls, children. We don't know if any of them were destroyed, any pieces were lost. But eventually the Bedouin decided to take them to the nearest town, which happened to be Bethlehem. And there they came to the shop of a man by the name of Kondo, you see in the picture. Kondo was a cobbler. And one cute story says that since these scrolls were written on leather, on animal skin, they thought maybe he could use the leather to repair sandals or something like that. I don't know, but fortunately for us, Kondo was not only a cobbler, but he was also a part-time antiquities dealer. And he recognized right away the importance of the scrolls. He couldn't read them. He didn't know what time period they came from. He didn't know what language they were written in. But he decided that they look like they're ancient documents. I'll take them up to Jerusalem and I'll see what I can do. And he kind of made an agreement with the Bedouin of profit share. Right? You let me take these up and I will split the proceeds, basically 2/3 for the Bedouin who found them and 1/3 for his dealer cut. Kondo winds up taking the manuscripts to Mar Athanasius Samuel. Athanasius Samuel was from Syria. He was the metropolitan of the Syrian Orthodox Church. So he's an Arab. Kondo thought maybe these scrolls are written in the ancient church language of this Christian group, which was called Syriac. So he brings them to Athanasius Samuel. They negotiate. He thinks they're ancient scrolls. He can't read them either. But he buys them for just under $100. So Kondo profits a tidy $30-some-odd profit. He gives the $60 to Muhammad the Wolf and his companions. And the scrolls now, the 7 scrolls that were originally found, that's what they pulled away first. And these are some of the best preserved scrolls of all the Dead Sea Scrolls, belong to Mar Athanasius Samuel. His task now is to figure out what exactly they really are. And so he goes to the Albright Institute, or the American School of Archaeological Research in Jerusalem, which you see in the picture. We're in 1947. If you know your history, the British Mandate is coming to an end. There are motions with the UN to partition, and it's in the fall of that year, 1947, that one of Athanasius Samuel's secretaries brings the scrolls to the Albright Institute. The director of the institute, who was a scroll scholar later on, is away. Because things had become so dangerous, they had kind of decided among themselves, the academics who were there, that they would rotate. There were 3 major ones. 2 of them would be away at any given time, and 1 would kind of stay around to take care of things. So the director was away, but the scrolls come on that day to a young American scholar by the name of John Trevor. And again, part of the interesting story of the scrolls, just how serendipitously at each step of the way it seemed like there was somebody there kind of in the right position at the right time to take care of the scrolls. First Kondo himself, and then Trevor. Trevor was a young doctoral student. He had just finished his doctoral degree. He wanted to become a professor. His mentor had told him upon graduation, he said, "What do I do now? Do I just go out and get a job?" his mentor told him, you should go to the Holy Land and get involved, see what it's like, right? Get some first-hand experience before you come back and start your career. And so Trevor is spending a year at the Albright Institute studying ancient inscriptions, going around to archaeological sites, and he brought with him his camera because he was an avid amateur photographer. In fact, back in these days, it was just a kind of an up-and-coming thing that you take photographs of your excavations. Up until that time, you know, before people would do some drawings here and there, but photographs were really far better. And so people would actually call for Trevor, come, you know, I'm exploring something, excavating something, come take photographs of it. Well, Trevor, that morning, he's shown these scrolls. He asked, where did you get the scrolls from? But Athanasius Samuel didn't want to let on too much too soon. So he said, well, we are cataloging manuscripts in our library, and we have here some manuscripts that we can't identify. And we would like to know what your opinion is. Trevor took a look at them. He recognized, first of all, that they were written in Hebrew. So he knew that they were ancient biblical manuscripts. In fact, the Isaiah scroll was one of the scrolls that came to him. Second, Trevor began to realize that these manuscripts could be very, very old. He didn't exactly know how old, but he thought they could be very old indeed. With everything so up in the air in Jerusalem and so many storm clouds gathering, Trevor asked very appropriately, very wisely, if he could photograph the scrolls. Number one, so that he could show them to other scholars and just verify his own conclusions. But in the back of his mind, he also thought, if any trouble does break out, and there should be war, it could happen, that the scrolls would be destroyed and be lost forever. At least we should have some photographic record of these things. And Athanasius Samuel agreed. Trevor took the photographs. To this day, Trevor's photographs remain some of the best evidence we have for the Dead Sea Scrolls. Unfortunately, the scrolls have deteriorated even since the days when Trevor got a hold of them some 60 years ago. So his photographs are particularly important to this day. Mar Athanasius Samuel had bought some of the scrolls from the Bedouin, but not all of them, it seems. Another group of Dead Sea Scrolls wound up going to Jerusalem and came to the attention of an Armenian antiquities dealer who also knew the Bedouin down in Bethlehem. One day, the antiquities dealer makes a phone call to Eliezer Sukenik. Sukenik at that time was a professor of archaeology at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He was born in Lithuania. He emigrated to Palestine in 1913 while he was still a young man. And then he undertook doctoral studies in Berlin first, and then in Philadelphia in the United States at the Dropsy College. After his graduation, he went back to Jerusalem and became professor at the Hebrew University. One day, he gets a phone call from an antiquities dealer friend who says, I have some ancient manuscripts that I think you might be very interested in acquiring for the university. Sukenik had come across ancient finds before. He didn't think there was any rush, but he sensed something in the antiquities dealer's voice that really aroused his attention. Now, back in these days, this is the fall of 1947. Jerusalem was divided. Barbed wire fences separated the Arab side and the Jewish side. The only way to get around was to get passes from the British Mandate, and all of this took time. But time they did not have. So they actually arranged to meet at the barbed wire fence. And on a bright afternoon, the Armenian stood on one side, Sukenik stood on the other, and he passed the Dead Sea Scroll fragments to Sukenik. Sukenik later tells us in his journal that as I went there, he said, I really was predisposed to think these scrolls have to be a forgery, because there were never any ancient scrolls, at least not as old as what he was being told these could be, that had been found in the land of Israel. In Egypt, I mentioned before, a lot of ancient manuscripts survived. But Egypt had special conditions. It was a very dry climate. And one of the greatest sources of decay to ancient documents is humidity. So that's why our best information for the Greek period and the Roman period, and even for the Pharaonic period earlier on in Egypt, comes from the land of Egypt. But not much from Israel, nothing from Greece, almost nothing from Greece, almost nothing from Italy, that go back 2,000 years. Sukenik, as I mentioned before, was an archaeologist. And he had excavated places and found ancient Jewish inscriptions. And he was an expert in particular on Hebrew ossuaries. An ossuary is quite simply a bone box. It's like a coffin. For a period of a couple hundred years in ancient Israel, there was a practice where when you were burying the deceased, you would lay the body out in a grave, kind of in a bench in a cave. After a year, when all the tissues had decomposed, you would go back and collect the bones, and you would put them in a bone box or an ossuary like this. These ossuaries are maybe a couple feet long and maybe a foot wide, and sometimes they had names inscribed on them, so you could see whose bones were buried inside. This one, and if you know Hebrew, you can almost make out that top word. It says Simon. It's spelled a little bit differently than what you would find it in the Bible, Shimon. The bottom part, this is an Aramaic inscription. It says Banei Hekla, which is the builder of the temple. This was Simon who actually helped with the building of the temple in Jerusalem in the days of Herod. Sukenik was an expert in these inscriptions. So he had one major advantage that others didn't have. He really knew what Hebrew writing looked like around the turn of the era. And he tells us in his diary that as he stood there looking at the scrolls, he could actually begin to read them, and it began to dawn on him. A forger could never have done this, right? But these, he said, I think these are really ancient scrolls that go back about 2,000 years. So this is important fact number 2. The Dead Sea Scrolls, we now know, date from the period of about 250 BC to about 68 AD. They span a period of about 300 years, and as we said before, this is one of the most eventful periods in Jewish history. All these events are happening in late November 1947. Sukenik learns about the scrolls. He goes home that night. He has just seen fragments. He asks, where did these scrolls come from? Where can I buy these? I'd be interested in buying these scrolls. He's told that there's an antiquities dealer in Jerusalem who has control of the scrolls, and you'll have to go down and negotiate. That very afternoon, Sukenik rushes off to the bank. He realizes he doesn't have much time to do all this stuff. He goes to the bank, and he actually takes out a second mortgage on his home so that he can get the money. He knows that the university will reimburse him later on, but he can't take any chances, right? It's too delicate of a time. So he's willing to go to that extent. And he's very, very excited. He comes home. He can't think of anything else except going down to Jerusalem, to Bethlehem. But in all of this, he makes one big mistake. And the mistake was, he tells his wife. And his wife says, what, are you kidding me? You're going to take a bus down to Bethlehem in the Arab-controlled territory while all of this is about to happen? We know the UN someday is going to vote on partition. She said, it's too dangerous. You can't go. Now, later that night, Sukenik is visited by his son, who also plays a significant part in this story. The son's name is Yigael Yadin. No, he wasn't adopted or from a second marriage or something like that. Back in those days, when people were just coming back and there were hopes of restarting the nation, many Jews who had come from Europe and their children took Hebrew names to kind of identify themselves anew. So Yadin is the son of Sukenik, but he's chosen his name, Yigael Yadin. Yadin at this time is a member of the Haganah, the Jewish Defense Forces, and in fact he is the chief. He's the one who is organizing the defense of Jerusalem if the UN votes to partition and if there would be an attack. Yadin is also a budding archaeologist. And so he comes home that night. His father tells him the whole story. And he lays it out before him. He says, Yigael, what should I do? And Yadin says later on, immediately there was a struggle inside of me. The archaeologist in me wanted to tell my father, go and get the scrolls. If we don't get them now, we may never get them again. But the son in me knew the dangers that were involved. And in the end, he said, the son in me won out. I told my father, it's too dangerous, don't go. Sukenik spent a fitful night. He woke up the next morning, and you know what he did? He went. He got on the bus. He went to Bethlehem. He entered the negotiations. He purchased the scrolls and arrived safely back to Jerusalem. That night, listening with his wife and his other son, they hear the news on the radio that the UN has voted to partition. Everybody, Sukenik says, poured out into the streets. His neighbors, there was dancing, there was great rejoicing. He said, I joined them with double reason to rejoice. Because not only had Israel, the hope of Israel to become a state, come alive, but also we had just recovered a precious part of our people's history. Sukenik began looking at the scrolls. I'll show you one other picture. This is actually Sukenik, working on the scrolls that he bought right there in his study. Very famous photograph. So Sukenik tried to figure out who could these Jews be who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. He knew about the time period, and he knew from the historical sources we had before that there were three groups of people, of Jews, around that time: the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. As he began reading the scrolls, he found out that there were a lot of commonalities with the group known as the Essenes. I put here a couple of quotes from an ancient Jewish historian by the name of Josephus. And Josephus says about the Essenes, they despise riches, and their communal life is admirable. In vain would one search among them for one man with a greater fortune than another. Indeed, it is a law that those who enter the sect shall surrender their property to the order. So neither the humiliation of poverty nor the pride of wealth is to be seen anywhere among them. Since their possessions are mingled, there exists for them all, as for brothers, one single property. And then it also talks, that second passage, how they didn't marry, and their practice of celibacy. Sukenik was able to match these characteristics in the scrolls that he had come in possession of, and so to him lies the credit for first identifying the Dead Sea Scroll group as Essenes. So this is an important fact, number 3. We always say history is written by the victors. The Dead Sea Scrolls give us the other side of the story. In other words, of the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. The Sadducees kind of disappear from the stage of history after the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. The Essenes likewise disappear, and the Pharisees become the winners. The Pharisees give birth to the rabbis, and as we said, modern Judaism derives from the rabbinic movement. But with the Dead Sea Scrolls now, we get a view that we didn't have before, namely the minority report. Now, since scrolls were found, everybody was very excited. This made front page in all the major newspapers. The question was, were there more scrolls out there to be discovered? And immediately there was a search in the desert to find more scrolls. Eventually, scrolls were found in 11 caves. And we give them numbers, not according to location, but just in the order that they were found. So the first cave was cave 1. and the last of the caves, Cave 11. Altogether, 11 caves. The cave in which the greatest number of manuscripts was found was Cave 4. Out of the 900 manuscripts, we found over 500 manuscripts in this cave alone. Here you see the opening to the cave, that kind of keyhole opening. It is probably the most famous picture of the Dead Sea Scroll caves.
What year is it?
What's that?
What year?
Was Cave 4 found?
Yeah.
This was about 1951, Cave 4.
So it wasn't by the Israelis.
No, it was by the Bedouin found Cave 4. I'm just about to come to the politics side of it, but yes, all of this was done by the Bedouin. The scholars were trying to find the caves. They did succeed in finding where Cave 1 was. Of course, the Bedouin said, well, we don't quite remember, and it took a while to find Cave 1. The Bedouin were at work finding other caves. Eventually, the archaeologists chased them away from this region, and they went farther south, and they found scrolls farther south. But I don't have time to talk about all those. Those came from the Bar Kokhba period. Then, the archaeologists headed down south when they realized the Bedouin hit gold there. Then the Bedouin came back here, and they found Cave 4. I don't know how it was, but the Bedouin really were much more successful at finding scroll fragments than the archaeologists were in the end. The archaeologists finally got here at the very last and were able to excavate a few fragments from the bottom of the floor, but that was about it. So here's the map. You can see at the time, the white is the territory of the state of Israel. The pink, whatever that color is, brown, is Palestinian territory, the Jordanian administered territory. And then the yellow in the center, that's Jerusalem, which was to be internationalized. But you can see Qumran is along the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, so it's in the Jordanian-controlled Palestinian territory. All the scroll fragments, therefore, came under their authority. Interestingly enough, at the time, Gerald Lancaster Harding was the chief of the Jordanian Antiquities Authority. Lancaster Harding was an American. The country of Jordan was kind of new at the time, and you know, in some of these positions they used outsiders. Pasha Glub was a famous example, and Lancaster Harding was a notable example. From 1936 to 1956, Lancaster Harding was the director of the Jordanian Antiquities Authority. He was a very good archaeologist himself, and he contacted a French archaeologist by the name of Roland Deveau, and together they started working to look at the site, figure out where did the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, where might they have lived and come from. Now, in the center, you see this Wadi Qumran, and Cave 4 is in that terrace above the wadi. Right nearby, you see on to the left of it is an ancient ruin. Nobody had really paid too much attention to the ruin before. It was called Qumran, which in Arabic means 2 moons. Well, obviously there was a connection, they thought, between the scroll caves and the settlement. So they started excavating the settlement, and in fact they found that it dated to the late Greek period through the early Roman period. Here are the ruins as they were cleared out by Deveau. You can see some of the buildings and a lot of the aqueducts and the cisterns. And here's an artist's reconstruction of what the site at Qumran looked like. It's very much a communal settlement with some large public buildings, a nice kitchen. They found about 1,000 pots and jars and so on. They found inkwells here. They didn't find any scrolls in the ruins themselves, but they found inkwells that shows that there was some kind of scribal activity going on. And all of this indicates to us that, in fact, this was an Essenes settlement that was responsible for the collection and the preservation of the scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls themselves, the fragments as they came in, started pouring in by the thousands. and they were brought here to Jerusalem to the Rockefeller Museum. Back in the older times, it was called the Palestine Archaeological Museum. But eventually they had a gift of money from John D. Rockefeller, and it was renamed the Rockefeller Museum. The Jordanians had set a price to the scrolls. They would pay the Bedouin a fixed amount, depending for every square centimeter of inscribed material. There was a certain kind of agreed upon price. And the scrolls came in. They were set out on long tables like this, under glass, and they began to be read and studied. But it was clear that they needed help in the deciphering of the scrolls. And so Lancaster Harding appointed DeVoe to be chief of a scrolls committee, a scrolls team that he would put forward. And here you see the team of 8 members originally. What they did, they asked the archaeological institutes, the French school, the American school, the British school, and the German school, to propose candidates to be on the team of scholars. And then they decided, to be fair, that they would mix it, half Catholics and half Protestants, right? So nobody could complain that they were being neglected. Interestingly enough, this guy John Strugnell that you see, we'll talk about him more later on, kind of in the middle of his career, he converted to Catholicism. The guy at the very bottom, Hunzinger, he didn't like the stuff that he had been given to do, so he kind of dropped out. And the Protestants took a little blow, but it was okay, because later on Millock, the Catholic guy at the top, who was the best Dead Sea Scrolls scholar of all, he dropped out of the priesthood and basically became a scholar working on his own. But in any event, here you have the original 8 scholars who were assigned to publish the Dead Sea Scrolls. Mar Athanasius Samuel. After the War of Independence in Israel, Athanasius Samuel wound up making his way to the United States. He brought with him the scrolls that he had purchased, the four scrolls out of the original 7. He decided that he would try to sell the scrolls. There's a famous picture, I tried to get a copy of it here, where he brought it to the Library of Congress, and he kind of rolled it out on this long table to show how magnificent it was. Remember Trevor had taken photographs of the scrolls? Trevor had told Athanasius Samuel, if everybody sees the quality of these scrolls and that they're real, the price will go right up. But that was the one piece of advice Trevor gave that was really not very good advice. Because when he got to the United States, Athanasius Samuel, as he said, you know, who wants to buy the scrolls, ran into some problems. Number one, nobody was really sure to whom the scrolls belonged. They were obviously Jewish scrolls. They were found in Jordanian-controlled territory. And they were kind of taken out of the country illegally. So if you spent the $1 million, and back then $1 million was a whole lot of money, you didn't really know if you would get to keep the scrolls. So there was no institution like a university or a museum who was willing to put up that much money for scrolls that they might have to return anyway. And then Trevor's photographs were published. For about $10, you could buy nice color photographs of all the scrolls that showed every detail. So why spend $1 million to buy the original when you could buy the photographs for $10? Athanasius kept the scrolls. And about 5 years after, in 1954, he decided to do something new. This is the famous ad from the Wall Street Journal. June 1st, 1954. Biblical manuscripts dating back to at least 200 BC are for sale. This would be an ideal gift to an educational or religious institution by an individual or group. Could you imagine seeing this ad in the Wall Street Journal today? Personal ad? Contact Box F, the Wall Street Journal. Well, lo and behold, Yigael Yadin, Sukenik's son, by this time, he had become general. He actually became chief of staff of the Israeli army. And by 1954, he was retired already, still a young man. And he had now become a professor of archaeology, like his father, at the Hebrew University. Sukenik, by the way, had died just the year before, in 1953. In 1954, Yadin is on a lecture tour in America, telling about his recent excavations. He gets a call one morning from a journalist friend. He says, Yigael, have you seen the Wall Street Journal today? Take a look at it. And Yadin sees the ad, and he immediately springs into action. Now, Yadin knows it would be very, very tricky for him to negotiate directly with Mar Athanasius Samuel because of the politics involved. So he contacts a lawyer friend, and the lawyer friend says, I have a client who is interested in purchasing the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they start negotiations. Eventually, they settle on the price of $250,000. Yadin buys the scrolls, and it's only after the purchase that Athanasius Samuel realizes that he sold the Dead Sea Scrolls back to the state of Israel. Now, Sukenik had 3 of the original scrolls. Yadin buys 4. Now these scrolls, the best preserved 7 scrolls, are back in Israeli hands. This is a statement from Yadin. I know where our time is moving quickly. But he said, I cannot avoid the feeling that there is something symbolic in the discovery of the scrolls and their acquisition at the moment of the creation of the state of Israel. It is as if these manuscripts had been waiting in caves for 2,000 years, ever since the destruction of Israel's independence, until the people of Israel had returned to their home and regained their freedom. This symbolism is heightened by the fact that the first 3 scrolls were bought by my father for Israel on 29th November 1947, the very day on which the United Nations voted for the recreation of the Jewish state in Israel after 2,000 years. These facts, he says, may have influenced my approach to the scrolls. Eventually, the scrolls were brought back to Israel, those 4, and a museum was created especially to display the scrolls. And it's called the Shrine of the Book, today located near the Israel Museum. In the left, you see the picture of the museum itself. What does it look like, the top of it?
The cover of the canister?
Right, the cover of the scrolls jar was designed that way. And the Dead Sea Scroll people believed that there were really 2 groups of people in the world. They called them the sons of light and the sons of darkness. So the picture on the right, you see the black wall. Now the top of the scroll jar is in white. This represents good versus evil, which is a major theme in Dead Sea Scrolls ideology. When you go inside the Shrine of the Book, this is what you see. As you go up the steps, you come to the great Isaiah scroll. It's actually, the circumference of that thing is 24 feet around, and you could walk right around and read the Isaiah scroll today. Let's see, this is the great Isaiah scroll in all its glory. Notice, in spite of the previous picture where there's a roller, whoops, go that way. What am I doing? Sorry. You see in the museum there's a roller, kind of a wooden dowel. The Dead Sea Scrolls had no wooden rollers, though. How do we know this? Look at the picture and you'll be able to tell. You see in the center of the rolled up portion how it's dark? That's from the oil of the hands. Right, so they would roll these things and touch the scroll. Very interesting. And you can see, if you look at the text part, right, this is one reason why scrolls become deteriorated. So you see the kind of the darkened spot there? And eventually, we know some of the scrolls had to be repaired from time to time because they became damaged. The Shrine of the Book was opened in 1965. Now we fast forward to the Six-Day War, 1967. In this war, the Israelis gained control of East Jerusalem and also, significantly, of the Palestine Archaeological Museum or the Rockefeller Museum. So the Israelis now control all of the scrolls. Yadin also, by the way, had, during the Six-Day War, been recalled to service, not as a general, but as kind of an advisor. And so he was very active, and he had soldiers under his command. In the years before the war, Yadin had heard about another scroll that was for sale. An American had sent him a piece of it, and he had tried to negotiate, but every time he tried to really come down to a price, the seller backed out. But Yadin had his suspicions that, in fact, it was from Kondo. And so, as soon as the Israelis occupied Bethlehem, which you see in the photo here, the sign with this guy is walking up to a kind of a gate, it says, "Welcome to Bethlehem." As soon as he knew Bethlehem was under Israeli control, Yadin sent a squad of soldiers. He said, "Go to Kondo's house and bring him to me." And they started negotiating with him. Eventually, Kondo told him, "Yes, indeed, I have the scroll." He produced the scroll. He sold the scroll. Kondo was not very happy about this. He always maintained he did it under duress. Even though he was paid, the price was about $167,000, he felt that it was not a fair price, right? He would have gone much higher. But in the end, Yadin was able to recover the longest of the Dead Sea Scrolls of all, which we refer to as the Temple Scroll that you see here. Here it is rolled up, and there it is unrolled. You can see the top of it has been damaged, so some of it's missing. And here are some fragments that are kind of deteriorating. Kondo was keeping this under the floorboards of his home. And it was a good thing that Yadin was able to recover it before it had deteriorated more. Not all the scrolls at the time of the Six-Day War were in Jerusalem. Some of them were in Amman, Jordan. And one of these was a very unusual scroll. It's written on copper, and it tells about a great cache of treasures, which nobody has ever found to this day, huge quantities of gold and silver. Some of the Dead Sea Scrolls were on display in Europe, and it became a question, right? To whom do we return these scrolls now? But in any event, when they returned them, since they had made the negotiations with the Jordanians, they returned them to Jordan. And so there are some scrolls and the copper scroll in Amman, Jordan to this day. Now the original team of scholars who had been assigned to publish the scrolls, they were appointed by the Jordanians. The one condition that they placed on the team of scholars, no Jews. These guys had some allegiance and loyalty to Jordan, right? And they didn't want the Israelis to come in and take away their work. This guy is one of the original scroll editors. His name is John Marco Allegro, a very interesting character. He published his volume of scrolls, and in 1968, this 5th volume came out. Notice the title of it, Discoveries in the Judean Desert of Jordan. All the other volumes, 1 through 4, had just read Discoveries in the Judean Desert. But now, because he wanted to make clear his view that the scrolls actually properly belong to Jordan, he added this title. It's the only volume that would have Discoveries in the Judean Desert of Jordan in the title. But because of this progress in publishing the scrolls is one of the reasons why progress totally broke down. Because the original editors didn't trust the Israelis. The Israelis had a tricky situation on their hands, right? What do? We control the museum where the fragments are, but the Israelis never went into the museum to really do anything with the scrolls other than inventory them. They didn't study them. They didn't look at them. This is what they figured. They took a long view approach. Ownership or possession is 9/10 of the law, right? You know that phrase? They figured we own the scrolls. We possess them. It's enough for now. What they didn't want was an international lawsuit where there was some kind of precedent, right? Some kind of statement from a court saying that the scrolls belong to Jordan. So they figured, we'll just wait. In fact, we now know that the original team of editors was preparing, in fact, to sue the state of Israel if they had taken any action. Jordan would have been the logical group to sue, the country, but if they wanted to sue, they would have had to have recognized the state of Israel's existence. So the Jordanians didn't do anything, but the team of scholars was planning, in fact, to sue. The one scholar who didn't pay any attention to all of this stuff was Yadin. Yadin went to the museum. He told people, bring me this scroll fragment, bring me that scroll fragment. And he had such authority and such clout that he was able to see whatever he wanted. In 1983, remember, he gets the Temple Scroll in 67. He works on it for a long time. It's his magnum opus. And he publishes in 1983 a 3-volume set, a study of the Temple Scroll, its significance, its interpretation, and so on. Yeah, if you can see, I wish I could get a clearer picture, but he published it in Hebrew. So now for the first time, remember, Sukenik published his original stuff in Hebrew, but then all those volumes that came out after were published in English and French. Now, finally, in 1983, the Israelis get their hands on a scroll for the first time. It kind of reinvigorates Israeli scholarship, Jewish scholarship on the scrolls. 2 years later, he publishes an English translation. But for those 2 years, right, it's a 2-year head start for the Israeli scholars. In the 1980s, the chief editor of the Dead Sea Scroll Project passed away. First it had been DeVoe, then someone else, and finally in 1984, John Strugnell takes over as editor-in-chief. You can see him on the left as a young man. He was actually one of the youngest of the Dead Sea Scrolls scholars on the original team. And here he is in his mature years working on some scroll fragments in the Rockefeller Museum. Strugnell was a very able scroll scholar. He did one thing that is probably his chief claim, and he would say it himself. He trained the younger generation. So you see the guy on the right, Strugnell was a professor at Harvard, and he trained his students in how to decipher, how to edit, how to publish the Dead Sea Scrolls. And many of the students wrote their doctoral dissertations on scroll fragments. Strugnell also did something unusual at the time. He started to bring in Israeli scholars. So Elisha Qumran, DeVoe Redimont, Emmanuel Tove, they were all students of John Strugnell. Strugnell made 2 major mistakes, though. By 1980s, the scrolls had been discovered around 40 years, but they still hadn't all been published. In fact, very few of them had been published. And people began wondering, well, where are these Dead Sea Scrolls we've all been hearing about? Strugnell's attitude is, we'll get to them when we get to them. We'll publish them when we're ready. In fact, in a famous interview, he said, the people who want the Dead Sea Scrolls now, he said, they're like fleas biting at us. Every once in a while, we'll toss them a bone and we'll let them go devour it. But it was very, denigrating language for this guy to use. When he was talking about some of the greatest biblical scholars who were around, who wanted to see what the Dead Sea Scrolls were like. The other thing he did that eventually led to his downfall, he gave an interview to a reporter for Haaretz newspaper. Strugnell, as I mentioned before, he was originally a Protestant. He had converted to Catholicism. His Catholic views were very pre-Vatican II. During an interview, the reporter asked him, well, what kind of problems do you see with Judaism? And Strugnell answered something like this, well, the fact that it still exists. Now, Strugnell's view was not, he was not a Nazi or, something like that. But what he meant, actually, was he saw Christianity as the true fulfillment, the spiritual fulfillment of the hopes of Judaism. And that biblical religion, what he understood as kind of animal sacrifice, was a lower level. So he believed that naturally Judaism should transition into Christianity. In any event, his remarks really set off a firestorm that he could never have predicted. And eventually, it led to his removal in 1990, and he was replaced by Emmanuel Tove. Emmanuel Tove was one of his students. And Tove was a brilliant biblical scholar. He worked on the Bible texts at Qumran. The Israelis made him editor-in-chief. Tove, one of his first things, one of his first initiatives was to enlarge the team of scholars. So they went from the original 8 to some 50, 60, 70 scholars to publish the Dead Sea Scrolls. And in his days, photographs of all the Dead Sea Scrolls were released so everybody could see whatever they wanted to. In the time since this resurgence of interest in the Dead Sea Scrolls, one of the benefits of the scrolls is that they brought together Jewish and Christian scholars in the scholarly pursuit of knowledge, probably more than anything else. If you look at Christian scholarship and Jewish scholarship 100 years ago, it was very separated. There were very few Jewish scholars who knew about the New Testament, and there were almost no Christian scholars who knew about the Mishnah, the Talmud, and Jewish writings. Today, it's very common to find Christian scholars working in ancient Jewish texts and Jewish scholars working on early Christian texts. My own mentor, Lawrence Schiffman, once said to me, the Dead Sea Scroll group, by the way, they didn't like the Pharisees, so they wouldn't have liked rabbinic Jews. They thought they were too lenient, and they certainly wouldn't have liked Jesus' approach to the law. So Schiffman said to me once, he says, very ironic that a group that would have hated both our guts had we existed in the time when they did, has done more to bring Judaism and Christianity together in the scholarly world than any other find of archaeology. And this is just kind of pointing the way forward. Most of the scrolls were brought to the Palestine Archaeological Museum. But we know here and there, sometimes there were some scroll fragments that were sold to private hands. And just recently, maybe 10, 15 years ago, a Norwegian collector of ancient manuscripts by the name of Martin Skuyen, that you see in the photograph there, purchased a collection of 60 Dead Sea Scroll fragments. And some of these you can see here. The set of fragments on the bottom right actually come from the Temple Scroll. And they're lost fragments that we didn't have before. Just recently, I got a phone call about a month ago from a friend of mine. He says, you know what? There are more scroll fragments out there. And right now, even as we speak, there are negotiations underway. Apparently, and I've heard stories from time to time, different Arab people have said they have Dead Sea Scrolls. Apparently, the negotiations are going on right now. So we shall see in the end where they end up. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Jealous of your students because I was biting my nails throughout your lecture. Very interesting. So thank you. We have some time for questions before we end today, and you can take them and we open it up for questions.
I see one right there.
Professor Erik Larson, I was able to see the very scroll, the manuscript, the 3,000-year manuscript, the summer of 2009, last year, and they were held a very big exposition at the Royal Ontario Museum in Canada.
Very nice.
And I understand that they were purchased in the 40s by the Canadian government, and they were working all these years to be able to put them together. And I was able to see the shroud that they were enveloped, the fragment that you were saying about the manuscript. And they were in special, we had to go with elevators in the museum down because they needed a very special temperature.
Right.
And they were enclosed in a glass case, a very special glass. It was magnificent, and we witnessed something that was dating since the Bedouin found them in that jar. They had even the exposition of the jar. I would like to know, of course they probably have gone to other places. You mentioned that at this time they are in Russia. Did you say
No, the oldest Bible manuscript that we have, complete Hebrew Bible manuscript, is in Russia. It belongs to the museum there. There's a museum that they...
And I suppose the Canadian government, that was the first time that they were exposed in 2000, a year ago, almost a year ago, 2009, July, August 2009, at the Royal Ontario.
There are exhibits of Dead Sea Scrolls. There have been in the United States, at the Metropolitan, in different places, different cities. I'd love to get them to come to Miami. A few years ago, we had a really nice exhibit at the Fort Lauderdale Museum. So these are great opportunities to see the scrolls. Today, they travel in special climate-controlled environment where the humidity is carefully monitored, and they try to keep the light down. Remember the photo I showed you where in the original museum where they had big windows, just flooding light onto the Dead Sea Scrolls. And that probably did a lot of damage to the scrolls. We have to remember, in the days when they were found, our knowledge of how to preserve these things, right? This is one of the battles of the scrolls being fought today, is to figure out how to really preserve them and keep them. Because a lot of damage has been done by well-meaning attempts, but unfortunate results. I want to say one thing, in that you may have gone to Jerusalem and seen that Isaiah scroll. When you see it, you can walk around it and read it from the outside, right? If you're going to show the scroll so you could see it from the outside, you have to unwrap it. And you saw that how it was wrapped around. Well, for 2,000 years it had been wrapped one way. And then they, in the exhibit, these were smart people, they rolled it the other way. After a few years, they realized it was starting to crack. It was bad. They took it down. In fact, when you go there today, it's still set up like that because that's how the museum was constructed, but it's a facsimile. Because that's what I mean. These were difficult things.
When the scrolls first came out, they said they were going to learn about secrets of Christianity and Jesus. Did that develop?
In a way, yes, but it's in a more sophisticated way. So the Dead Sea Scrolls don't mention Jesus or John the Baptist or any Christian figures. But what they do is they kind of show us the different viewpoints in Judaism. There are some points of contact and a lot of differences. So the Dead Sea Scroll group was much more strict about keeping the Sabbath than Jesus was. That's a point of difference. On the other hand, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls mentions a figure who's called Son of God. It's the first time in a Jewish text that we have this title that the early Christians used for Jesus outside of the New Testament. There's been debate, long story short, in my view, I think it's a messianic title. So it shows us that that title was there before the early Christians came along. So there are some points of similarity and some points of difference. But the Dead Sea Scrolls are really important for us to understand that. Sometimes you may have heard, if you read things, that the Catholic Church suppressed this or that. But remember I showed you the makeup of the Scrolls team. Half Protestants, half Catholics. So the Catholic Church didn't have control. And if you knew Millich, if you read his life, you'll know that he didn't care what the Pope said. So they published the scrolls. The Vatican never had control of the scrolls. They were never in Rome. It's just a kind of story that people had.
How come it was no Jewish for the Islamic kings?
No Jewish? That was the one condition that the Jordanians put on DeVoe. He said, choose anyone you want, but no Jewish scholars. In the end, it probably did have some consequence for the publication of the scrolls. Not because the Christians weren't trying to do their best, but there were two reasons for it. Number one, the Christian scholars weren't experts in Jewish law, halakha. They just didn't know how to do that stuff. So the way it really influenced them, they published the texts that they felt they worked on the best and knew the best first, which were the things that were probably most like Christianity. And the other stuff they published a little bit later. Yes?
Is it true that all of the scrolls were written in Hebrew? And is it also true that at the time of Jesus that he and his sect, whatever, spoke Aramaic rather than Hebrew? So how did the two connect?
We have three languages of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Hebrew is the greatest. About 85% of the scrolls are in Hebrew. Aramaic represents about 15% of the scrolls. And then there are a handful, a dozen, that are written in Greek. So we know this was a trilingual area. Hebrew, though, was the sacred tongue. In fact, the Dead Sea Scrolls give us the earliest phrase. That phrase, sacred, holy tongue, holy language, Lashon Kadosh. That's found in the Dead Sea Scrolls for the first time. So that was the language of religious discourse. And people would still understand it. But as far as we could tell, the everyday language of Jews, ordinary Jews, was Aramaic. So that Ossuary I showed you, they're writing in Aramaic because that's what they spoke. There are a few phrases in the Gospels like Talitha Kumi and Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. Those are in Aramaic. So we know Jesus and ordinary people spoke Aramaic in those days. But Jesus could read Scripture, so he probably knew Hebrew too.
Is there any physical evidence of what happened to the Essenes
It's fascinating. You know what? When I wrote the dates for the scrolls, I said about 250 to 68. How did I know 68 if I was, just saying around 250? That settlement at Qumran was destroyed by the Romans in the first Jewish rebellion. And we know, our documents tell us the Romans came through that area in 68 on their way up to Jerusalem and they destroyed Jerusalem in 70. That was when the temple was destroyed. So 68 is when the settlement at Qumran was gone. Everybody wonders, what about the caves? Some people think that the Essenes saw the Romans coming, and so they try to hurry out of there, and they left their scroll fragments in the caves. I don't know if they maybe packed some of them in the cloth, in the jars. Other stuff we know, by the way, was just put on the floor. It wasn't found in jars. Only a few of them were found in the jars. So whether they knew or whether they fought and they were destroyed, because there is some evidence that the Romans actually attacked that settlement, that's how they met their end. Their ideas, though, continued on. And then again, I wish the story spreads out so wide. But the earliest Dead Sea Scroll was found before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. What? How could that be? It was found not in Israel, but in Egypt, in Cairo. At the old, there's the old part of the city called Fustat. There's a Jewish Geniza. At the end of the 1800s, two Scottish twins found Geniza manuscripts, and they brought them back to England, and they gave them to a professor that they knew of Hebrew studies by the name of Solomon Schechter. And Schechter studied these things, and he actually published it. He didn't know what group it came from, but there were some time indications, some dates in the document. He knew it came from around this time. Now, they're medieval copies, and he published them, but he said they must go back to something ancient. When they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, sure enough, they found that document. We call it the Damascus document. So somehow, some of the Essene ideas survived, and that old Cairo Geniza was very influential among the Karaites. If you know this Jewish movement called the Karaites, they reject rabbinic authority. So it's really a fascinating story. But their ideas must have continued on through the Middle Ages. We have copies.
One more question. There were the Protestant, the scholar, Protestant, and the other scholars were Christian. One of the Protestant scholars, you mentioned, he dropped and he became a Catholic Christian. However, the other one, I think was a priest, really,
Right.
dropped his faith, Catholicism, and became whatever, and it spent his lifetime. Was it because of the way they were studying the fragments and the manuscript? Was it the outcome, or whatever it transpired of them switching, one completely dropping Protestant and the other one
Right.
Catholic? Is it because of what they're finding in those 3,000?
It doesn't seem to be related to what's in the scrolls, though. That whole story of the individual lives of these guys is really, really interesting. In one way, the Dead Sea Scroll group, when you read the Dead Sea Scrolls, they believed that they had the one true teaching from God, and they wouldn't reveal it to outsiders. That original team of 8 scholars, they were working, they did a lot of work, but in the end, they wouldn't let anybody else see it. That's why this whole thing with Strugnell, right, it became a great outrage. Why haven't you released these after 40, 50 years? And Strugnell said, we'll let them out when somebody told me they're reading the scrolls and they're imbibing all this stuff. It's our secret, and we only tell people when we want to tell them and how much we want to tell them. That was unfortunate. So it may have influenced them somehow, but I think it's more kind of...
And that is what we see in the Vatican whenever they want to, emphasize or,
Right. Question?
Professor, you mentioned, I'm trying to get the inventory straight. There is stuff that was in jars, the scrolls, and then you mentioned 900 documents. I'm trying to translate or relate or picture what are we talking about. I know what
Right.
fragments are, but I'm not quite sure what you mean by 900 documents.
Well, those... the first 7 were pretty well preserved.
Okay.
But the other stuff that came from the caves came in fragments. Some the size of my hand, some the size of a fingernail. They took all these fragments and they brought them to Jerusalem and they started assembling them, like the world's biggest jigsaw puzzle. Now, how would you assemble these things? you could sit there and try to see, does this fit with this? Does it, but you're dealing with
By content?
thousands, tens of thousands of fragments. So what they did, exactly right, they started reading them. And they read them and they said, are they Bible? Bible was the easiest because they knew it. And then they would put everything from Genesis here, everything from Exodus. Now, maybe you have 10 manuscripts of Genesis. How do you tell them apart? By the handwriting. Everything that fits with one hand is here. Everything that fits with another hand is there. So that's how they did their work. Then the stuff that they didn't know before, right? They're unknown works. All they could do is look at the handwriting and try to put these things together. Sometimes, let's say one scribe wrote 5 different works. We put all those fragments together because they're the same hand. But I can't really tell for sure, is it 1 work, is it 5 works? That's why there are some uncertainties that remain to this day. If we can fit them together and match them up, it really helps us. But we can't always do that. So that's why even I say we have about 900 manuscripts.
Different contents, 900 different, that would have made up a book. And the other question was, when you said a copper scroll, I just saw a board and something that looked like trunks.
Good question. I like you, very observant. Why did the copper scroll look like it was sliced up? Well, it was rolled up when they found it. They tried to unroll it, but it started to break in their hands. No good. They wrestled with this for a long time, and they couldn't come up with a solution. Finally, they took it to England, to Manchester, and a guy there who had a diamond saw cut it into strips. And that's why you see it. And they still leave it kind of curled up. If they had waited longer, today, we can do more with it. We could have unrolled it. But, they couldn't wait any longer. So they did what they had to do.
There were green troughs. Is that the copper?
That's the copper scroll. It's oxidized, right.
In sections and in strips, as you said.
Exactly. So they took photographs of it, and just recently there was a big attempt, $1 million effort to kind of clean it up and understand it even better.
Thank you. So have they published most of the knowledge they've gained from these sea scrolls yet, or not yet? Or?
Well, it waited till the 1990s before photographs were finally released. Under Emmanuel Tove, they published about 30 volumes. Right? Up until that time, they had about 10. Then, under his leadership, 30 more volumes. Today, everything is published. So this is the period. Now we're trying to put it all together. 900 manuscripts, it's a lot. And people are trying to figure out the true significance. But we're working on it.
So it hasn't yet been incorporated into the knowledge we have yet?
I think a lot of it has. But, people will look back and say, this is the period of doing that, or they'll figure out. We know anyway, they're published. And there's still, people are still trying to figure out. Still debates going on.
3 short ones. One is who wrote all of it? The Essenes? They wrote all of those scrolls? Or yeah?
Yes. I always say, think about this. If a synagogue library or a church library was to survive 2,000 years, what kind of books would you find in it? You would find some books that were sacred, its place of worship. But then you would also find some religious books. Now, you would probably find religious books that the group wrote, and you would expect most of the books would be the books that the group liked. But they might have some books that they didn't like, that they were trying to figure out, how do we answer these people, right? And they might also have some books that were not written by them, but just that they thought were pretty good. And that's what we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the early days, everybody said the Essenes wrote these things. But obviously, they didn't write the Bible, right? That came from, they inherited that. So they had those. They had some books that we know of from elsewhere that we knew before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. And these were just kind of Jewish documents from the time. And then they had some that they had written themselves. All these kind of rule books, right, where they say about joining the group and this kind of thing, those are from the Dead Sea Scroll group themselves. We call them sectarian literature. So that's the one where we actually find the view of the Essenes.
Folks, we have time for one more question, so we'll go. Yes, please.
Okay, how anxious and why were the Jordanian archaeologists to excavate?
Repeat his question.
Why were the Jordanian archaeologists eager to excavate? Well, partly everybody was talking about it. It's good, even if the Jordanians right? They didn't care religiously about uncovering some past of Judaism, but they recognized that this put them front and center in academic circles, right? It was good publicity. And of course, it could bring tourism, and if you have Dead Sea Scrolls there, Arabs that want to come see. So there were lots of different reasons for them to be interested in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Thank you very much for your attention. And thank you for your great
I feel like I'm acting when I'm standing up on this thing. Let me, before you all go, let me thank Dr. Larson for his time. This was a spectacular lecture. We always try to end our year with a bang, and this year is no exception. So hearing from an expert is wonderful. Thank you so much for your time here with us. I want to thank all of you again for a wonderful year. We have some cold drinks there, I see, because we see that people are starting to